Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Okay. Hey guys. Preemptive like Warographics, love this channel. What will Sweden bring to NATO? A Warographics analysis. I've been not so productive today, which hasn't been very rare. Anyways, my name's Connor. I like to learn about things. The original link to the video, top of the description. Below that, link to the Discord. Would love to have you. Makes it easier for me to interact with you and see your recommendations. Let's go. All right. Ready to learn. If you are not ready... Well, is this a learning video? Yeah, it is. Yeah, of course it is.
It will be the moment when 200 years of defense policy are ripped up. A shift in Northern Europe so seismic it will almost have to be measured on the Richter scale. Since the end of the Napoleonic era, Sweden's maintained a policy of strict neutrality. In both World War I and World War II, Stockholm managed to keep itself apart from the bloodshed. Throughout the Cold War, the Swedes likewise remained independent of the Great Two Blocs, wearing...
Let me go back like 10 seconds. Sorry, I was fixing the...
of strict neutrality. In both World War I and World War II, Stockholm managed to keep itself apart from the bloodshed. Throughout the Cold War, the Swedes likewise remained independent of the Great Two Blocs, wearing their non-aligned status as a badge of honor. Last year, though, that neutral stance finally evaporated. Following Vladimir Putin's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, Sweden's government applied alongside Finland to join NATO. At the time of recording, that application is still being held up by Hungary and Turkey, but most analysts believe Stockholm will eventually become NATO's 32nd member. And that raises...
I don't know what it is with Hungary, but with Turkey, isn't it something about Sweden, not something about the Kurds, something?
A vital question. Will eventually become NATO's 32nd member. And that raises a vital question. What will Sweden bring to the alliance? On paper, a country of 10.4 million peaceniks might not sound like a great addition. Yet while Sweden's standing army might be small, the military punches way above its weight. In domains as disparate as cyber, air, and naval capacity, Stockholm commands serious forces. Forces we're going to analyze in today's video.
I love how it's consistent with, like, whether it was Gustavus Adolphus or Charles XII, or just how Sweden is always, they seem to have a super advanced military, but just don't have a lot of people. So, but in my opinion, and what do I know, right? Let me know if I'm wrong. I might be. Just with Finland and Sweden, I feel like where they are, their geography, their geographical location in Europe is just so big. It creates such a larger umbrella, and yeah, and so you have so much of the Baltic now surrounded by NATO countries. Gotland you have, which is like a perfect, middle of the Baltic Sea aircraft carrier type piece of land. Yeah, and with Finland too, like now, whatever that is, the Baltic Sea goes, like that little sliver goes towards St. Petersburg in between Finland and Estonia. That must have a name, something, but now both sides of that. So Sweden and Finland big on just the geography itself, on top of all the military stuff they bring.
For anyone following European news, May the 18th, 2022 was a day that offered a lot of action. In Ukraine, hundreds of defenders of the Azovstal plant surrendered, bringing a close to one of the war's earliest major battles. Up in Kiev, the first Russian soldier to be tried for war crimes appeared before a local court. But it arguably wasn't on the battlefields of Ukraine that the biggest story was unfolding, but nearly 2,000 kilometers away in a wood-paneled room in Brussels. There, the ambassadors from Finland and Sweden jointly handed application letters to NATO Secretary Jens Stoltenberg. In doing so, they transformed the security architecture of Europe for decades to come. Prior to this moment, the two Nordic nations had been famous for their non-alignment. On our earlier video on Finland and NATO, we described how Helsinki had maintained neutrality for nearly 75 years. But what was a massive psychological shift for the Finns was on a whole other level for the Swedes. While Finland had been steadfastly neutral for over 7 decades, Sweden had clung to its non-aligned status for over 2 centuries. Beginning in the last years of the Napoleonic Napoleonic Wars, when Stockholm was forced to
Bernadotte.
cede Finland to Russia after the Finnish War, that neutrality had survived some of the greatest conflagrations to sweep Europe. Even the continent-wide murder-suicide pact that was World War II managed to leave the Swedes relatively unscathed, and the Cold War was nothing if not a demonstration of how a non-aligned Sweden could happily prosper. The key question is, what changed? What about the present moment is so volatile that Stockholm feels more vulnerable than it ever did during the era of Blitzkrieg?
My opinion is, right away is that my first thought is that in world wars, in World War II, especially when Germany had taken over France, they had taken over Norway. Who is going to come to your aid right away? And I feel like now with NATO, you have a lot of other countries to back you up in case the threats you do see, like Russia, do attack. Well, it's more of an obvious answer as to what's more safe. It's more safe to be with NATO since you are surrounded by NATO countries who are in a, and so aid will come if you're attacked. Whereas that wasn't so certain, I don't think, during even the Cold War, and it's certainly when Germany was at the top of its game in World War II. The risk of being invaded and horribly, without, you know what I mean? Like that's sort of my.
On the face of it, well, the answer seems pretty simple. Vladimir Putin's genocidal war in Ukraine has overturned decades of defense planning in Europe, sending non-NATO countries racing for the shelter of the nuclear umbrella. But that's only the surface-level answer, the catalyst for this shift rather than the underlying cause. Unlike Finland, Sweden shares no land border with Russia. It has no significant Russian-speaking population that Vladimir Putin might want to protect. More to the point, Stockholm went the entire Cold War without feeling the need for a nuclear umbrella, comfortable in its ability to defend itself. And it's here that we get to the deeper level answer for Sweden wanting to abandon its neutrality, the steady erosion of the nation's defense capacity. The key to Sweden's non-aligned status was a policy variously known as deterrence through strength or heavily armed neutrality. Similar to what Taiwan's military planners now call the porcupine strategy, the idea was to make Sweden such a nightmare to conquer that even the Soviet Union would judge the costs to be vastly outweighing the benefits. Like Finland, that meant maintaining a conscription model that provided a highly trained reserve force that could be activated at a moment's notice. In Sweden's case, that force totaled 850,000 men. Like Finland, it also meant investing in weaponry far beyond what a nation of its size might normally wield. Unlike with Finland, though, Sweden's heavily armed neutrality didn't survive the biggest geopolitical shift of the last 35 years, the end of the Cold War. While Helsinki continued to maintain a vast reserve army, Stockholm allowed it to wither in the soft glow of peace. The defense budget was slashed, the funds redirected. The Navy and Air Force shrank by around 70%, the Army by a staggering 90%. In no time at all, that 850,000 strong reserve force had dropped to a mere 10,000. By the mid-2010s, the military had seen such deep cuts that garrisons were being shuttered, even in regions vital to the nation's defense, like the island of Gotland. Conscription had been scrapped, military spending dropped to barely a single percentage point of GDP. All of this on the back of the idea that peace in Europe was here to stay. And of course, we all know what happened next. On February the 24th, 2022, Vladimir Putin unleashed his assault on Ukraine. As missiles pounded Kiev, it was like the lights had finally flicked back on at Europe's post-Cold War party. And Sweden was among those nations sheepishly caught with its trousers down. As director of studies at the Swedish Defense Research Agency, Robert Dalcio bluntly told the New York Times, "We had our dream, and now it's time to wake up." Given all that, you might now be under the impression that Stockholm is going to be a drag on the alliance, that the Swedes are running for NATO protection because their modern military consists of two guys called Bjorn driving an armored Volvo. But that impression couldn't be more wrong, because while Stockholm doubtless regrets its deep military cuts, that doesn't mean the Swedes have nothing to offer. What the Nordic Kingdom lacks in manpower, it more than makes up for with cutting-edge technology.
Guys, in my opinion, the importance of a country joining NATO it should be scaled on, does, say, Russia have to go through any NATO countries to get to you? if not, and you're somewhat near Russia, like for instance, Iceland is Iceland in NATO? I feel like they wouldn't really meet the so take a nation like the Czech Republic, okay, or Austria, right? That is you are surrounded on all sides by NATO countries, and so you could essentially drop out of NATO, and I'm not saying it'd be a great idea. Drop out of NATO and cut your army to next to nothing, because the only way for Russia or a non-NATO country to invade you is to go through NATO countries. What are they going to do? Like a over air that they're not going to be able to move troops through? But say like Iceland, for example. I'm not saying that Iceland would be a big target, but if Russia went crazy, or Finland or Sweden they joined, is that if Russia just wanted to go to a very weak country where we've seen in Ukraine that NATO countries and nuclear powered countries aren't willing to go in and send men in to a war that a country is waging with Russia. And so if that's possible, and when that happens, are you likely to not get help either? Then it's enormously important. But does that make sense? I don't know.
Back when we did our Finland video, one of the very few problems we highlighted was Helsinki's lack of a solid defense industrial base. In a war of attrition, Finland would become quickly dependent on other NATO allies for resupply. In Sweden, the situation is more or less reversed. While its tiny standing army and reserve forces wouldn't even be a rounding error compared to what Helsinki can field, Stockholm has the capacity to produce both small arms and high-tech defensive kit. So much so that Sweden is both one of the world's leading arms exporters and one of the largest arms manufacturers per capita. But this kit isn't just built for foreign markets. In pretty much all domains, Stockholm is able to combine internationally purchased kit with homegrown weapons platforms to compete with the best. Let's start with the Swedish Navy. While relatively small compared to other coastal nations, Sweden fields a navy with an excellent reputation for stealth. Central to this is the domestically produced Gotland class of submarines, of which 5 are...
I always thought of their air force as being kind of their... Like when I think of the submarines, didn't these, destroy in a war game an American aircraft carrier? But Sweden has a good air force,
known to be in
doesn't it?
operation. The diesel-electric sub, the Gotland has been called, quote, one of the most advanced submarines in the world. It's also one of the few non-nuclear submarines capable of staying underwater for weeks at a time rather than days. Its biggest claim to fame comes from war games conducted with the USA in 2005. In a mock-up battle, one Gotland sub managed to score direct hits on the $6 billion aircraft carrier USS Ronald Reagan without ever being detected. This, despite the...
Guys, if that was war, not a war game, like the war game is supposed to simulate, like, so in real-time war, if the US was fighting Sweden, like in that confrontation, Sweden would have legitimately just sunk a carrier with an American nuclear carrier with, which is nuts, because if we were fighting Sweden, which would never happen, that would be so embarrassing that they just with one sub just took out an aircraft carrier.
Carrier USS Ronald Reagan without ever being detected. This, despite
Come on,
the Americans
US.
fielding anti-submarine escorts and an entire
good job,
task
guys.
force. The anecdote nicely demonstrates the stealth capacity of the Swedish Navy, a capacity that carries over into the Visby-class corvettes. Essentially, Sweden's warships, the 5 Visbys, are designed to remain hidden to enemy radar, undetectable at range, even as they pack some serious firepower, like the naval gun Bofors 57mm Mark.
Did we destroy any submarines? I'm trying to grab for like anything of my ego.
Mark 3.
But we killed one, right? Did we kill
locally
him?
designed and built machines armed with gun Bofors 57mm Mark 3. These are locally designed and built machines armed mostly with weapons built by Swedish firms, principally Saab Bofors Dynamics. And yeah, that's the same Saab that used to be best known for building cars. Today they're apparently more focused on supplying NATO armies than ensuring a comfortable drive to IKEA. Still, this defense industrial base doesn't mean the Swedes don't also buy from partner countries. The army Army's main battle tank, for example, comes from Germany. Stockholm has something in the region of 120 Leopard 2A tanks. Air defense likewise relies on foreign tech. In 2021, Sweden became the first non-NATO nation to receive Patriot systems from the US. Yet, even in the domains where they're happy to rely
Why does Germany always have the best tanks? Even in World War II, they had the best tanks too, right? What is it? Can we steal some of their tank engineers?
to receive Patriot systems from the US. Yet, even in the domains
the Abrams
where they're
better
happy to
than the
rely on
Leopard?
outside systems, the Swedes still produce their own powerful machines. Those 120 Leopard 2As, they're backed by something in the region of 500 CV-90 infantry fighting vehicles, among the best in their class in the entire world. It's stuff like this that demonstrates why Sweden's tiny army is not to be taken lightly. In the event of shooting war
Those are
between NATO
cool.
and Russia,
I'm
Stockholm's
pausing so much, sorry, but those are cool looking guns.
army
Looks like a shotgun, but then with a long extension.
is not to be taken lightly.
I gotta
In the
stop
event of shooting war
talking.
between NATO and Russia, Stockholm's homegrown equipment, designed with the frigid climate of North Europe in mind, would be instrumental in securing the alliance's northern flank. This includes in the
Mermaids?
cyber domain. Unlike most Western countries, Sweden has been actively pursuing offensive cyber capabilities for years. As the Atlantic Council wrote in 2022, if recent exercises are any indicator, Swedish cyber capabilities are already among the most advanced in Europe.
Okay, what is cyber warfare? I don't even get it. Is that like hacking satellites, like enemy satellites for intel, or hacking computers in other countries to get classified information, or is it like hacking military systems to like make them shut down or something? Like, what is cyber warfare? Or is it cyber warfare?
Really, though, it's not for Sweden's cyber efforts that NATO is desperate to get Stockholm in the door, nor is it for what the Army or Navy feels, impressive as their kit is.
Air Force.
No, there is one single domain where the Swedes really shine. One area where their expertise and equipment could make a crucial difference in any Europe-wide conflagration. We're talking, of course, about the Swedish Air Force.
I knew it. It's the only part of the Swedish military that I already knew had a reputation.
Anyone watching CNN last May might have been surprised when a segment aired calling Sweden one of the world's top-ranked air forces. After all, this is a country with only 10.4 million citizens, a nation with a GDP on par with Ireland. This is on a continent that boasts the British RAF, the French Air Force, and Italy's sizable Aeronautica Militaire. So the idea that tiny Sweden can compete in the air should be laughable. It should be. But it isn't, because CNN wasn't just indulging in cable news hyperbole. Stockholm really does possess an air force that could put many of its peers to shame. The main reason for this is the nation's homemade fighter jet, the Gripen JAS-39. Designed when the Cold War was still ongoing, Gripens had to work to a very specific set of requirements. They had to be cheap, since Sweden couldn't pour the sort of
Guys, I love how I think Lockheed Martin is ours, or Boeing, but I love how so many nations, their engines and aircraft, like Saab right there. I know, like the really good Japanese defense is like Toyota's, not Toyota. It's something Mitsubishi and something. And it's just funny to see that like regular standard car producers, not even like luxury ones or anything, are also in like the jet engine market.
Resources into its combat craft that America or NATO could. They had to be easy to operate and reliable, less flashy than stuff like the F-16, but also requiring less maintenance. Finally, they had to be capable of short takeoffs and landings, since Swedish defense plans called for following dispersed operations doctrine in the event of war. In practical terms, that meant pilots had to be able to fly sorties from remote roads in the Swedish wilderness where an invading force would be hard-pressed to find and destroy them. The result was a machine that Aviacy Online describes as a small but competent fighter, a robust, cost-effective weapons platform capable of doing serious damage. Those capabilities have only improved since the Cold War ended. Today, 1-seat Gripen C varieties are equipped with MBDA Meteor long-range air-to-air missiles and a cutting-edge active electronically scanned array system. The most modern E-variety Gripens are even capable of supercruise flight.
Jesus, look how loaded. Oh, you guys told me these aren't bombs. These are fuel tanks, right? But that's a bomb. Those are missiles, right?
them in a rare group alongside craft like the F-22 Raptor, the Eurofighter Typhoon, or France's Dassault Rafale. In short, these are craft that compete at an international level, so much so that heavy-hitter nations like Brazil rely on them to protect air power. Currently, Sweden has nearly 100 of them, 75 C variants, 22 C to D variants, and just 2 of the ultra-modern E variants, though some 58 more E-craft are scheduled to be delivered in the near future. All C and D aircraft are also planned to undergo upgrades that will keep them working and relevant through to 2035, when the whole fleet will be replaced with newer models. So, yeah, there's good reason people seriously into combat aircraft have a secret soft spot for Sweden's Air Force.
Does Sweden have any good natural reserves, natural resources, like, I don't know, whether it's like good fertilizer mining areas or do you have any oil or natural gas resources, or I don't know, uranium or something?
But combat crafts aren't the only things a modern air power needs. They're also the less sexy but still vital functions like airborne early warning and control craft and intelligence gathering vessels.
Still sexy.
And, well, Sweden shines here too. As Defense News recently reported, Stockholm is set to buy 2 of Saab's new GlobalEye AW&C craft. According to the manufacturer, GlobalEye, quote, combine air, maritime and ground surveillance on a single platform, all in real time. To that, you can also add 2 Gulfstream 4 aircraft.
I don't get what he means.
Well, Sweden shines here. Craft and intelligence gathering. Only things a modern air power needs. They're also the less sexy but still vital functions like airborne early warning and control craft and intelligence gathering vessels. And, well, Sweden shines here too. As Defense News recently reported, Stockholm is set to buy 2 of Saab's new GlobalEye AW&C craft. According to the manufacturer, GlobalEye, quote, combine air, maritime and ground surveillance on a single platform, all in real time.
Are they talking about the Air Force or the Navy now?
To that, you can also add 2 Gulfstream 4 aircraft modified for intelligence gathering. Now, we don't want to turn this entire chapter into a geeky lovin' for Sweden's Air Force, or for you to leave with the impression that Stockholm could project air power on a similar level to a nation like the USA. It's absolutely not the case. Even Sweden into a geeky lovin' for Sweden's Air Force, or for you to leave with the impression that Stockholm could project air power on a similar level to a nation like the USA. It's absolutely not the case. Even Sweden's...
I heard, I don't know if this is true, okay, but I heard that like the second largest air force in the world is the American Navy. I don't know if that's true or not, but I do know our budget is kind of high for military spending.
Own generals wouldn't try to claim that. Their air force, for example, has a clear and noticeable weakness where large transport craft are concerned, fielding only 5 C-130H Hercules. It's hardly anything for NATO to get excited about. But what we're trying to do is paint a clear picture of a nation that consistently punches several classes above its weight in the air domain. A country that won't be a drag on NATO, but a worthy addition to its northern flank. Not that the alliance would be in much of a position to reject Sweden, even if its military offered nothing more than flat pack furniture and ABBA tribute bands. And that's because Sweden,
Nothing wrong with that. Love ABBA.
Nation, represents something NATO can't afford to ignore. Something that has nothing to do with technology or defense industrial bases. And that's a way to project NATO power in 2 vital bodies of water.
Give us Scotland. Sweden doesn't border the Arctic, does it? No, it definitely doesn't. Or does it? Is it Sweden or Finland that don't border the Arctic? So obviously one is the Baltic Sea. That's one. And the second, I'm assuming, would be near Murmansk, Russia, and the Arctic, but I don't even know if they have an Arctic coast. I think it does. Does Norway wrap around the entire Arctic coast of the Scandinavian peninsula until Russia?
One of Vladimir Putin's stated reasons for unleashing his war on Ukraine was to halt the further expansion of NATO. As many have noted, his actions ironically had the exact opposite effect. When Finland joined the alliance on April the 4th, 2023, it more than doubled the land border that Russia shares with NATO. But even that strategic blunder may pale compared to Sweden joining. Or if, or when, Stockholm is finally admitted to the alliance, it will transform the Baltic Sea from a region bordered by members and non-members alike into little more than a NATO lake. If you look at a map of the alliance from before the Ukraine...
Yeah, baby. Yeah, baby. This one right here. Give it. I feel like just Gotland joining NATO is a big deal.
War. You'll see an obvious weak point, the mere 65-kilometer strip of land connecting the Baltic states with the rest of the alliance. As we covered in our earlier video, Finland's accession eliminated that problem, creating a straightforward way to resupply Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania via sea. Sweden's accession, though, will go one step further. Rather than eliminate the
What is the distance between Helsinki and Tallinn? What is the capital of Estonia? Vilnius? Tallinn? I forget. Riga?
it around, creating a world in which the Baltic Sea suddenly becomes Moscow's obvious weak point. If you look at that map again, with Sweden and Finland both in NATO, we can see that Russia only has a couple of tiny strips from which it can access the Baltic Sea, two strategic choke points that the alliance could potentially blockade. The first is in the Gulf of Finland, the strip of water separating Finland and Estonia. A blockade here would not only cut off St. Petersburg from the sea, it would also trap the Russian Baltic fleet in port at Kronstadt. The second is the water around Kaliningrad, a Russian exclave bordering Poland and Lithuania. Just 200 kilometers from Sweden, it houses one of Russia's only ice-free ports, as well as a serious military base. But given any ships trying to exit will have to pass through both Denmark and Sweden, its use would evaporate in wartime, especially when you take into account Sweden's nearby island of Gotland. A strip of land a hair under 3,000 square kilometers, Gotland has been called an unsinkable aircraft carrier, a place from where a military could dominate maritime and air traffic over the Baltic Sea. As such, it's long been a premier Russian target. Back in the Cold War, Swedish spies uncovered Soviet
Right, so why did... No, so Iceland is in NATO, so thank God. So I feel like if it is a really large part of water, but an other obvious, so they have Vladivostok, right? They have St. Petersburg and they have Murmansk as their three sort of ports. They do have, and obviously they have some ports on the Sea of Azov and on the Black Sea, Caspian Sea too, but doesn't connect to anything. So this all now, so getting through to the sea from this part of Russia, right? They got to go through the Black Sea, through the Dardanelles, or the Strait, Istanbul, NATO countries, through the Aegean, either go through the Suez Canal or go through past all these NATO countries through Strait of Gibraltar, right? So that's all tough. Now, especially with the addition of Sweden and Finland, you got to go through past Estonia and Finland, all through a NATO lake, as you said, with Gotland there. Through, I guess before Sweden joined, they could go like this way, but now you got Denmark and Sweden there, and so the big, you have Vladivostok, but that's not very helpful if you're trying to attack Europe, right? And so that now the best way they have to get to the Atlantic is Murmansk, right? But if they don't already, they should have a lot of NATO naval bases on the northern coast of Norway here, and should have some on this part of Norway. What is that? Shetland Islands or something? Right here, and then on here, which is, I forget, and then some on Iceland, and then maybe a base on Greenland. They'd still be able to get out probably, but if you could just do a lot of radar stations, military detect aircraft, submarines, you could really just, only option they have is to like go under the Arctic. So anyways.
Plans to occupy the island in premier Russian target. Back in the Cold War, Swedish spies uncovered Soviet plans to occupy the island in the event of war. Sweden's neutrality be damned. Closer to our time, Gotland was the subject of a jingoistic Russian documentary broadcast on the eve of the Ukraine war, one which described how Moscow could capture it alongside Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. For this reason, Stockholm long kept a mighty military presence there. During the Cold War, 25,000 troops guarded the place, with another 25,000 in reserve. Harbors were filled with mines, 25 fixed artillery pieces and 36 tanks were ready and waiting for a potential battle. But the peacetime cuts destroyed all of that. Today, Gotland is protected by only 300 to 400 soldiers. The coastal defenses have been dismantled. The submarine base, incredibly, was almost sold to a Russian businessman. Although Sweden is rapidly trying to remilitarize the island, it's currently a weak link, a place Russia's forces at Kaliningrad would almost certainly try to seize in the opening hours of a full-blown conflict. If Sweden joins NATO, though, Gotland could go from being a potential problem to a potential lifesaver, a place the alliance's forces could fortify and use to dominate the entire Baltic Sea. With fellow NATO member Turkey also capable of closing the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits, Russia could quickly find most of its European ports cut off from the wider world. Most, but not all of them.
Just like Great Britain was such a great aircraft carrier to prepare and get forces ready and everything in process for the invasion of Normandy, I feel like Gotland could play a similar role if we were to have to come to aid of our NATO allies, of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania.
In the far north, ports like Murmansk would still have access to the Atlantic via the Arctic Ocean. And that brings us neatly to another reason why NATO wants Sweden on side. Admit the Swedes to the club, and every Arctic nation not called Russia will be an alliance member. There are 8 Arctic nations in the world: Canada, the USA, Denmark via Greenland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia. Of these, Russia controls the majority of the Arctic coastline, slightly over 50%. It has also invested heavily in military infrastructure in the region. As the planet warms and Arctic ice begins to recede, the region is only going to become more important to shipping. At the same time, energy and mineral resources are going to become available to exploit.
This is why I think the invasion of Ukraine, you have so much with global warming. You're one of the very few countries in the world that you're going to benefit a lot from global warming. You're going to have so much claims to the Arctic Ocean. It's going to be crucial. Shipping lanes, your airspace already is enormously powerful to wield. Going to be a lot more arable land without permafrost for farming, and if Russia would just become a much more capitalist, or just not authoritarian, the future of Russia could be so bright, and then just because you're Putin's ego, you got to get Ukraine too, is just
that means the chance of confrontation in these waters will increase. As the Council on Foreign Relations has put it, having 7 of 8 border nations in NATO, quote, allows the alliance to pursue a more coherent strategy in the region. This is potentially vital for both European and American interests, not just because of Russia, but because of another nation that's expanding operations there. China has plans to create a so-called Polar Silk Road using the Northern Sea route, massively increasing Beijing's influence and power in what's becoming a highly contested region. For US lawmakers looking to try and contain China, a NATO-dominated Arctic is one of the few ways of countering the CCP's northern plans.
How is the CCP? They have to go through the Bering Strait. They're not close, all right, to the Arctic Ocean. They have to go all the way on the Kamchatka Peninsula. They have to, go around Japan, around far eastern Russia, past Alaska and Russia, into it that way, through the Bering Strait. And I mean, Yeah.
At this stage, though, we're still just looking at ways Swedish membership could potentially benefit NATO, and interesting as this is, there's a whole other aspect we really do need to consider, and that's just how compatible are Stockholm and NATO going to be. Although they cooperated closely as non-aligned countries, the ambivalence felt towards NATO in Stockholm and Helsinki was not identical. The Finns had living memories of Russian aggression in the form of the Winter War fought between their nation and the Soviet Union in World War II. So when Putin's Russia finally showed its true colors, Finland was almost immediately ready to throw its lot in with NATO. By March 2022, polling showed that over 60% of Finns wanted to be part of the alliance, a number that eventually rose to over 80%. In Sweden, though, things weren't quite so clear-cut. With no Russian land border and no personal memories of Russian aggression, Stockholm was ambivalent about ending its neutrality. As late as mid-March, Prime Minister Magdalena Andersson was saying she saw no need to apply to NATO. The public too were unsure. Even in April 2022, polls were showing fewer than half of all Swedes supported entering the alliance. To put that in perspective, this was after the discovery of Russian war crimes at Bucha, when the world already knew the arbitrary torture, sexual assault and murder Moscow's forces had visited upon civilians. For some, this reluctance to follow the Finns was ascribed to Swedish psychology, the idea that Swedes see themselves as natural peacemakers and a force for dialogue on the world stage. But this assessment skipped over one key point in the Sweden-NATO debate. The Swedish military had already been cooperating with the alliance for decades. The partnership between the two forces began almost immediately after the end of the Cold War, with the first steps being taken in 1992. By 1994, Sweden was an official member of the NATO Partnership for Peace program. Not long after, the two began conducting joint military exercises. In many ways, this step was practical. In 1995, both Sweden and Finland joined the EU, a move that included signing a mutual defense clause. With many EU members already in NATO, working with the alliance would clearly be necessary in any continent-wide war. Yet Sweden's cooperation with NATO would go deeper than what was strictly necessary. As we mentioned earlier, Stockholm received equipment from the alliance, becoming the first non-member to host a Patriot system. Not only that, but it also joined NATO on active missions. The NATO force in Kosovo, KFOR, has included Swedish troops, as have NATO forces in Afghanistan and Iraq. During the 2011 intervention in Libya, Sweden's Air Force was involved in enforcing the no-fly zone. According to the Dutch magazine Militaire Spectator, during the mission, quote, Swedish aircraft seamlessly integrated with NATO air forces. In other words, Sweden isn't some outside force coming into NATO, not knowing the difference between Article 5 and a piece of pickled herring. It's rather a nation that has spent decades now hovering on the threshold of membership without ever quite stepping through the door. That doesn't mean there won't be issues when or if Stockholm is allowed in the club. Just to take one example, NATO countries commit to spending a minimum of 2% of GDP on defense. While only 7 of the 31 members actually hit that target, most are at least spending over 1.5%. Sweden, on the other hand, spent a mere 1.2% in 2022. Within the alliance, that would make it one of the lowest spending members, ahead of only Luxembourg, Spain, and Belgium. And while there are plans to boost spending by billions of dollars, it will take at minimum until 2028 for Sweden to come close to the 2% target. Despite all of this, though, it seems today that
why? What are the obstacles? This is one of the things that it seems like the 2% is not mandatory. It's optional. It seems, because does anyone ever face any consequences to not having 2%? You know, why should other countries have to pay 2% or more to cover the countries that aren't paying 2%? That just seems unfair. I think that should be a bit more strictly enforced.
Sweden may finally be ready to step over that membership threshold to become NATO's 32nd member. Back in May of 2022, polling reported a majority of Swedes wanted to join the alliance for the first time in history. Since then, that number has only grown, not to the sky-high levels that have been seen in Finland, but to a solid 60%, which is a solid majority by any stretch. The new government under Ulf Kristersson has followed this shift. On March the 23rd, 2023, the Riksdag voted to join NATO. 296 lawmakers were in favor, only 37 were against. But this doesn't mean it's a done deal. At the time of recording, alliance members Turkey and Hungary are both withholding approval of Sweden's accession, a major deal, since joining NATO requires unanimity. It could even be that this approval never comes, and Stockholm is left eternally out in the cold, no longer neutral by choice, but forced by politics in Ankara and Budapest to remain non-aligned. but this seems unlikely. Right now, the smart money is on Turkey and Hungary eventually dropping their objections. When they do, NATO will at last admit its 32nd member, a member that is a lot to give. Now, as we've hopefully shown in today's video, Sweden's membership isn't a magic bullet for the alliance, nor is it the equivalent to inviting in a major power on the scale of the US or even France. What it is, though, is a win for NATO on multiple fronts, a much needed boost from a military that may be small but plays to its strengths with deadly precision. A military that can help ensure safety and security in Europe for generations to come.
I think that it's not just NATO.
Operations doctrine in the event.
A great video, by the way, as always, from Warographics. I don't think that I truly believe I'm not sure about Finland. They have a history with Russia. Ukraine has a history with Russia. Belarus, obviously, they're not. But when it comes to Sweden, especially, I think that NATO would send troops in, including the U.S., to Sweden if Russia attacked Sweden, even if Sweden wasn't in NATO. Well, why didn't they do it for Ukraine then? Ukraine wasn't in NATO. They got attacked by Russia. I think it's just countries will protect other countries that they see as more important to their own security or economic prosperity, and for instance, Kuwait. Why did America go to such a defense of a non-allied country to the U.S.? Why did they send their own people in to die, right? And to help Kuwait? Well, because if Saddam kept Kuwait, then he would have had had something like 45-50% of the world's oil, and then there was a real risk of Saddam just pushing into Saudi Arabia to the oil fields in Saudi Arabia, which I don't believe are very far. I think most of the oil in Saudi Arabia is in the southern eastern coast side, or is in the mid-east southeast of Saudi Arabia, which is say mid-east, sort of near the Persian Gulf. And so if Saddam went into Saudi Arabia with its giant army, likely and quickly taking the oil drilling in Saudi Arabia, then they would have, I'm sure, 60% of the world oil or more. And so the reality is sad, just the reality, right? It's not sad or whatever or happy. It's just reality. Is that countries depend on alliances, right? But even outside of alliances, when you're not in, if you're going to cause a bit of a pain for the world economy or then they're going to intervene, right? So I'm not saying that. I'm basically saying that what happened with Ukraine, where they weren't in NATO, and so we weren't willing to defend Ukraine against Russia with boots on the ground, right? I think would happen in some ways. I truly believe if Sweden was attacked, like Ukraine was attacked, I'm repeating myself, then I think NATO would have gone to full war to protect Sweden. Yeah. I hope you guys are all doing well. This is a tremendous video. I'm sure I said a lot of stupid stuff, but that's what you guys are here for, to correct me, teach me something. Or if you learned something, that's awesome. Hope you guys are doing well. Let's keep learning. If you are not doing well, I mean this. Emotion or mental health is no joke. It's a big thing for me. And chin up. You'll be good soon, all right? Don't worry. Love you guys. See you next time. Bye.